Okay. So today's 60-minute tech talk on collaboration at Cardiff University using Office 365. So I'm just going to hand over to Richard, and he's going to take over and start presenting, and he's going to go through the agenda with you.
Thank you very much, Annette. Welcome everybody. Thanks to all you guys and girls attending. So the agenda for today is pretty much similar to what we ran back earlier in the year, and with just a few updates on things that have happened since then. So I'll talk a little bit about the Office 365 collaborative toolset at Cardiff. I'll then talk specifically about rolling out OneDrive for Business, which we have now actually completed for both staff and students. I'll talk about enterprise enabling YAMMER, and then as to where we are going next, which is basically starting to roll out Office 365 groups as a service and actually developing SharePoint online as a service. So I think the way I can best epitomize Office 365 at the moment is from a quote from Forrest Gump. It's like a box of chocolates, you never know what you're going to get, and that I think is still the case 6 months on from when I first talked about this in April. There are still, it's very much rapidly evolving with new features constantly being added to the mix. So just to give you a bit of catch up of where we were at Cardiff previously, our collaborative environment was provided by on-premises IBM software. So the basis of that were 3 IBM applications, one of which was Domino Notes for mail and calendaring, IBM Connections, which allowed us to deploy wikis, blogs, and various collaborative applications, and a thing called Lotus Quicker, which was a place where people could put their documents, a bit like SharePoint in many ways. And we've still got that latter service. We still use that today. However, we are in the process, as we'll see, in migrating from that. So when we were running Notes Domino, it has to be said it was a very unpopular offering, and so we looked at moving to something else. Now at that time, cloud alternatives were just starting to come to the fore. So this was in 2013, which seems an awful long time ago, and we basically looked at 2 products. Office 365, which had sort of just emerged from being live at Edu, and we looked at Google Apps. To cut a long story short, we chose Office 365, and in 2014 we began the migration from Lotus Notes Domino to Office 365, specifically the component Exchange Online. So at that time, the offering for Office 365 was basically 3 components. It was Exchange, it was Link, and it was SharePoint Online. But our focus was primarily on mail and calendaring, though we did implement IM for staff, but not for students. It was very well received. It was seen as a huge improvement over what we were currently what we had previously offered. It took away a lot of the stress of building servers and supporting the Domino infrastructure.
Oh, look at that.
But obviously, as we'll talk about, it brought its own different type of challenges. So we now have Office 365.
This screen's going wildcast.
Sorry guys, could you keep the sound down please? Or mute yourselves. So the current provision we obviously have Exchange Online, We now have Skype for Business, but we have now actually got that as our telephony solution, and we are running that on premises. We have OneDrive for Business enabled for staff and students. We also have for project staff, Project Online licensed. We provide Office Pro Plus for both staff and students. And most of the other applications are actually available, and we've made Office 365 groups available. It's probably easier to say what we haven't made available. So currently at the moment we haven't got Power BI available to our staff and students, and we haven't got Office Stream available to our staff and students, but everything else I think that's actually on the app launcher is visible to them. Okay, so as time went on, Microsoft developed OneDrive for Business.
No, that's fine.
So the driver for this was actually our information security framework program, which was concerned about people using storing data in things like Dropbox, and wanted an alternative where the sort of capabilities of Dropbox were actually available, but the data was stored in a secure area. Chris, can you mute yourself, please?
I didn't remember that going into my calendar.
No.
I have headphones.
So Office 365 OneDrive Business was chosen because the data stored in Dublin and Amsterdam, and that was accepted as an acceptable place for our data to be held. So the driver for OneDrive for Business was at that time very much around protecting the data, making sure it didn't go into places where we couldn't access it and where we didn't know it was stored. So it was rolled out to staff and students during 2017. So why we started this back in 2015. Why the delay? Well, quite simply, it was the Microsoft Group client. Microsoft offered this as an alternative to Dropbox, but their initial offering wasn't up to the job. And it took that time for them really to sort it out. We believe most of that, or almost all of that, is resolved, and we are feel it's a fairly feel it is a stable service for our users. So during the rollout, we created training materials and did various posts online. About just before this, we'd actually enterprise-enabled YAMMER, and we set up forums in this for discussion to support staff, so we could disseminate information and respond to any feedback and comments on that. We also provided training sessions on its use to show people what it could do, and to sort of go through scenarios where which were useful to people in their work. So key points around this is that OneDrive is really for files relating to the user, not groups. As I say, we've made groups available to people, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but we wanted to make the key point to people is that OneDrive itself was for files specific to the user. One thing we have had to make clear to people is there is no Microsoft SLA around backup, and so we advise our users to back up any important data onto other systems. Microsoft will back it up, but it's not written down in any sort of way. So that's a sort of covering our backsides on that one, just to say that that is the situation. So we market it as a place for users to access files that they're working on currently, and on those who wish to collaborate on documents. It is currently not advertised as a replacement for our central file store service. So over the time when we were rolling this out, we found that calls to the service desk were quite manageable. and our usage now, this time, when I wrote this slide, it was up to 8 terabytes. I think we're up to about 25 terabytes now. So there has been a take-up on this. During the rollout, Microsoft constantly made changes to the interface, and this makes it difficult for our training team, or did make it difficult for our trainers to keep up. But I think this is something which is this is quite common in Office 365, as I'm sure many of you are aware. During the time, they also made changes to default behavior and around the sending, sharing links, which I think has now been changed again and is probably, I think it's back to where we would want it to be in terms of default behavior. And we've also taken out, or took out very early on in when we moved to Office 365, we took out MS Premier support. Now we have and continue to find this useful. It does cost, and I know some institutions don't feel that that's been worthwhile, but we have had a lot of use out of our Premier support, not just from calls responsive. The advantage of having a technical account manager is very good, and we were also able through our account manager to talk to the developers around OneDrive. So we felt we got a lot of value out of that. Okay, so that's OneDrive. As I say, it's now rolled out to staff and students across the campus. It is being used.
Hi, Richard.
Sorry.
Can we take a natural break there, if that's
yes,
all right?
That's fine.
What you were saying, because you've spoken about OneDrive, and I'm just interested to know who or how many institutions that are attending today have already rolled that out. So I'd like to do a poll, if that's all right. So the first poll is going to be about, let's just bring it up, whether your institution is using OneDrive for Business. So that would be really good if you could just show me. Great, so that's 78%, 79% that are using it. That's fantastic. 21% considering, and still 7% not using it. So that's interesting. I'm just going to save those as well. Save the poll results. Fantastic. Okay. So another poll I'm going to just have a little look at with you is whether you're using Office 365. So that's a slightly different question. Last time, which is interesting, in April, it was 85%. So I'm just going to open that poll. Let's just see how many of you are using Office 365. So last time, like I said, it was 85% were. Okay, so it's a bit different this time. Oh, it's getting to the same actually. So we've got 10% considering it and 2% not. So that's interesting. I'm going to save those as well. Okay. So just another question. Just bear with me while I bring that one up. So this is the third poll. And I'm going to just open this one up. And this is, please indicate if your institution is using YAMMER. Now, Richard's just about to talk to us about YAMMER. So this would be interesting to see, actually. So we've got 47%, 50%. So about half of the attendees today. So yeah, that's interesting. Okay, so I'm just going to save those as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to where we were. And hopefully it's gone back to the same slide. It should be loading for you. But yeah, let's have a look at some questions while we're at it. The chat's been quite busy with some questions and answers. Thank you, Lynn. Okay, so I'm just going to have a little look at some of the back. So a question here from Victoria. Has OneDrive helped collaborate with externals? Are there any issues to be aware of? So Lynn replied, no. No slowdown that I'm aware of. There are some issues with clients we need to look into. So clients quitting unexpectedly, so that's interesting. Ebe asks, do students use OneDrive? If so, how do they use it from apps that aren't OneDrive aware? Interesting. Do you have many groups? Lorraine, a lot. I don't really understand that part of the conversation, but Lorraine's saying that they have at St George's. Okay, so Mark says rolled out for students, not staff, but in process for staff. So that must be still the OneDrive part of it. Correct me if I'm wrong here, please, guys. Richard has said there's about 3,300 groups. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So, what are they? What the people using the groups for, Richard? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That's a good question. I wish I probably could tell you what they're using it all for. One of the groups is a fundamental component now of Office 365. It's a membership service, and if somebody creates, even if they create a SharePoint site now, they will get a group. If they create a planner, if they open Planner and that will also create a group. So some of these groups are the users in some cases may not actually be aware that they are creating a group. So it's almost it's difficult to know. But groups within themselves, people are using it to share documents. So whereas I mentioned that OneDrive is for personal use for the individual, groups allows people working on a project, for example, to share files between themselves and work on those together. So we believe a lot of the groups are actually are being used for that purpose. Some of the groups I think have just been created as a consequence of a user running a particular app.
Right.
But we are in the process, as I'll mention, of creating a service around groups, and in our migration from one of the one of the IBM applications to that, we will be making use of groups for that.
I mean, it's funny because we're just we've rolled out OneDrive for Business to students over the summer, and we're just starting to think about it from the staff perspective. But it's the differences between groups and teams that we're trying to get to the bottom of, and I think, as I understand it, the groups bit is the background side of it, the admin side, and the teams are for the users to sort of create their own teams within. Would you agree with that, or would you disagree with your experience?
I think you can. I think there's two levels of groups. You can use groups as in a sort of more corporate, in a sort of enterprise way, though you might be thinking more about SharePoint Online there, but it's the same thing. So yes, groups you can use for an enterprise, across the enterprise, and more administrative with more stricter controls. But you can also use groups if people just want to start up some ad hoc collaboration. So if you were working on I'll say a project or something, if I'm working on something, trying to roll something out for IT, I will create a group around that, and for the technical aspects, and then just get the relevant people in that group, and we can share documents within that, etc.
Right.
So I think you can use groups in both ways. Teams is a relatively new feature, which I think Microsoft have got very excited about, and is taking us for, again, I think a bit like yourselves, we're still trying to figure out all that.
Practice.
So practice, because I think when I first gave this presentation, we'd only just started, we'd only just made Teams available, or we were about to make Teams available. So yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges here, is to actually try and work out what you can use these tools for and what's the best way. That it's that box of chocolates again. You're never quite sure what, and and I think Microsoft are also, they tend to release the application, and then further on down the line they start to put in the controls where you can manage that application.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Okay.
Interesting. Thanks for that, Richard. Sean's pointed out that the poll is per delegate and not per institution. Good point, Sean. Thanks for pointing that out. So we will have to consider that when we look at the results. Okay, so are we okay now to hand over back to Richard? Are you okay to talk to us about YAMMER, please?
I am. Okay. Okay, so sort of concurrently with the rollout of OneDrive, or just before, we actually made YAMMER available to our users, again both staff and students in this case, from the start. YAMMER, some of you may know, was bought by Microsoft many moons ago, and is in many ways a very different beast to the rest of Office 365. And over the last 2 or 3 years, Microsoft have been working on integrating YAMMER into the Office 365 platform, and still continue to do that. So the first thing we had to do to get YAMMER into our system was to actually get hold of the domains that belong to Cardiff University, or things, because with YAMMER anybody could create the domain cardiff.ac.uk and join that, irrespective of any controls that we could put on that. So our first thing was to take over that domain, which we did, and we integrated them into our Office 365 tenancy in January 2016. Again, like OneDrive, we provided training in its use, and we launched a service in what is an annual event called the University Speak Week. So we did some work around that. We also created an all staff group within YAMMER, so people could just put up any topics there and talk about anything across there, trying to create a social network. I think now the number, I've got 2,000 active users there. I think that's probably gone up now to about 4,000. So it is used. It's used quite well. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's very useful for those people who want to use it. Again, possibly another thing we're trying to work out here is when should you use YAMMER, when should you use Teams, because you can do conversations in both. And I know my colleague Chris Graves has been working on advice about when to use what particular type of application in this regard. Now the whole Office 365 suite now, the government is now overseen by a program called the Digital Workplace Program, which overlooks the rollout. It's not specifically targeted at Office 365, but Office 365 technologies do form part of the tool set which will enable, which we can work on to enable a digital workplace here at Cardiff. So the next steps in terms of our Office 365 work is we need to migrate existing services from legacy applications. We've done connections. That has now gone. We've actually switched it off, and we are now we're working with consultants to move our Quicker service, which is effectively a document repository service, from IBM to Office 365. The migration paths we've identified are YAMMER, Office 365 groups, and SharePoint Online. Majority of what we will do will be going into Office 365 groups. Within Office 365 groups, you get a team site, which is SharePoint. And within SharePoint Online, you can put a document repository. So we are moving our users into an Office 365 group or specific groups tied to their particular work, and building team sites for them within that. The majority, as I said, are document repositories. Some are with granular permissions, so some people obviously give people read access, author access, edit access, whatever. So depending on the type of permissions they need, this is the type of group they will get on the team site within the group. and we are still working on developing Office 365 groups as a service and to put in a support structure around this. We never switched off groups. Groups appeared one day in a very sort of crude form in Office 365, and we just carried on and let that happen because our policy was if it didn't contravene anything, if there was no data security issues, etc., then we would just let users use the tools. Obviously, we're playing catch up in terms of service, but we felt by switching anything off, we could be storing up trouble a little later. You could argue we're storing up trouble now, but we've taken a policy just to make things available unless there is something that we don't like. So, for example, if we felt the data was not held securely anywhere, then we wouldn't necessarily release that the service. So we've been quite sort of relaxed, if you like, about how these applications and services have appeared. One of the things is that we feel, that we know that if we'd switched off groups, it breaks functionality in other areas. So we've gone along with that. I mentioned earlier about conversations, Office 365 groups. So this is a slide really that refers back to that. So you can have different conversations within, depending on whether you create a YAMMER group or an Outlook group. And again, Chris and his enablement team are documenting approaches to that and advice to our customers, our users on that. So Teams has come along. As I said, this was about, I think at the last session I gave, we just released it. We've made it available. We haven't really converted it to a service. We're still trying to get our heads around this in terms of what that people are using it. Research, we are known that some people are forming ad hoc collaborative teams, and within IT we use it. We have set up a chat room in Teams for feed monitoring and chat about any incidents that happen. So we believe it's a useful feature, but we're still getting to grips with that. And in particular, we're getting to grips now with the fact that we understand Microsoft recently announced at Ignite that parts of Skype for Business will be incorporated, or Microsoft Teams will incorporate the functionality of Skype for Business. What that means for Skype for Business on premises, I don't know, but that's what we're trying to find out. I don't think there's going to be an immediate problem on that, but again, this is something else that's changing as we go along. So if I just summarize benefits, challenges around this, I think the key thing is that the functionality that is provided by Office 365 is something that we would struggle to maintain and provide ourselves. So in our old way, when we built servers and we ran systems and updated things, I think we'd find it very, very difficult to do that. So the fact that this is provided for us is a good thing. It has been pretty well received. I don't know if in most cases there's no feedback, which I always take as good in IT, because normally you just get shouted at if something's going wrong. So I think we've made this is perceived as a very good system. The fact it's accessible from many clients is very, very good. And Microsoft have done a lot of work on making apps for their various services available. It's the Mac client, the Office client there is much superior to what it was. So I think they've taken that very well seriously. It's a very different Microsoft, I think, than 10 years ago. The downside, of course, is the pace of change is rapid, and that makes it very difficult to actually keep up with it and actually to provide that support that people would want. But and though most changes are flagged, some creep through without warning, and I don't know if anybody's looked at the admin console. There's very often an apology in there when they've released something without giving advance notice. I believe that's actually getting better. And keep pressure on Microsoft to work on that. And the other thing I would note is that, as I've already alluded to, is that products are released and they're not completely finished. So they have a tendency, it's almost like we're developing it for, we're at a beta test for them. So, but in sort of, if we looked over the whole piece, I think this is more good than bad, but it does have challenges. And I think one has to be pragmatic about how one proceeds with that. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so I'm just looking in the chat here. There's a lot of questions coming up. So trying to look at them to bring to the group. Gareth asked, does it get confusing for users having so many groups listed in the address book? Yes, says Liz. Ebe, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Not eBay, apparently. Are you using any group naming conventions, prefixing? So Gareth replied, yes, it can, which is good. And Di has mentioned that a group is a membership unit and Teams is a service that requires a group. So that's quite interesting. Let's have a look. Moving down here. Can you restrict who creates groups? I mean, I would be tempted to create one called Vice Chancellor. That could be quite useful. But probably not really. And not really, but I think when I spoke to other people, it needs somebody to keep an eye on what groups are created. But I think there is a tool that somebody else has mentioned to manage that. I think Lynn mentioned that. So that's interesting. Richard Perry has included a hyperlink to a help page about choosing the domain to use when creating Office 365 groups. So I think that's very interesting, and I will be sending that to our infrastructure guys, to see if that will help them with the rollout. So it feels very quiet at the other end. I hope you've seen the chat as we've gone along. This session has been recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. So that's something that you can refer to later, or you can recommend any of your colleagues that may not have been able to attend the live event today. There are going to be some more webinars or 60 minutes tech talks created for next year. So keep your eye out for those in the mail shots. We are in the process of confirming our 4th spotlight on digital capabilities next year in May. So depending on the venue will depend on the date in May, but it will definitely be 2 days. I'm just keeping an eye on the questions coming up here. Hannah has asked a specific question. How do you differentiate between use of Office 365 and the VLE? Do students get confused about where and how they can communicate with tutors and fellow students? What do you think to that, Richard? Can you give us any...
I don't really... I mean, we've just made Office 365 available. Well, OneDrive's just been made available to them. I'm not aware... I don't know if Chris could comment on this one. Chris Graves? Yes, please, Chris.
Yeah, hi, sorry about the microphone earlier on. Yeah, basically we're positioning Office 365 as a place for doing your work, getting stuff done, rather than part of the VLE. There may be specific academic tutors who will set up a YAMMER group or something like that, but I believe on a very individual basis. So if you're trying to work on your stuff, writing an essay or something like that, using Office 365 with OneDrive, you can use that on the fly on anybody's laptop. You can jump onto a mate's laptop and run up an incognito browser and carry on authoring your essay in your friend's room on their laptop. So it's a work environment, whereas the VLE is your learning environment. Things may change, but that's how it is at the moment.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, that's interesting, and I think a lot of these systems that are rolled out it's the working practices that go around it and giving that advice out to students, which I think is really important. What I've found as well is for those students that have already got a personal OneDrive for Business, I think that can be an issue when they first start using the university one, because they've then got two different accounts. I think it's just letting the students realise which area they're working in, and I think that can be quite important, especially when they start syncing their work as well. So yeah, there's quite a few elements to consider with these sort of situations.
Around the sync question, our students don't have access to the sync client on their
right. So you turned it off.
On the managed workstation. I mean, obviously, if they've got their own laptop, etc., then they can download the sync client. But at work, at college, they would just access via a web browser. Now, some of you may be aware that there is a new upgraded client in the latest iteration of Windows 10, which is called OneDrive On Demand, which means that you can actually see all your files in OneDrive, but they're not actually synced down. So by the start of the next academic year, I think we'd be looking to roll out Windows 10 capability to students which would have that client on. So that means they wouldn't fill up the disk, and they'd be able to get their files on demand. So, but currently, yeah. So that's a development we're looking to push out for the start of the next academic year.
Can I just come in with the thing about getting confused? A number of students might be using Google Drive or Dropbox. So the key to that is to say, if you've got personal OneDrive, it's just a third personal space like those others. I think with the sync client, you can actually sync the two different things into side-by-side folders. So you could put your stuff that's nothing to do with Cardiff University or whatever university you're at in your personal one, if you really want to keep it out of the domain of the university.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, that sounds sensible. Okay, so I'm just looking at some of these messages. John's asking, what version of Office do your staff and students have access to? I think that question might be to you, Richard.
That's Office 2016. So on our managed desktop service, we use the volume license version, which is a little behind the Office 365 Pro Plus client, which is the one that gets updated monthly. So staff and students, if they go to the Office 365 portal, then they would be downloading the Office 2016, the latest version of that.
Yeah, that sounds sensible. So John says thank you. I don't know if you've seen that. Jody has asked, how do you manage data loss prevention with the sync client and data from Office 365?
I don't think we do that ostensibly. We don't use any at the moment. We're not using DLP. We have guidance on where people can keep data. We have an encrypt for our laptops. We have an encryption service, so laptops are actually encrypted, so they can download data onto that, and as long as it's encrypted, that's fine. And staff are not supposed to use personal devices, things they bought down PC World, for university data. It's probably something we'd look to tighten up, to improve on in going forward. But we've sort of managed most of this by policies currently, so users can sync data to their machines. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. Okay, so I think that might be about it for today. I think that was really useful to have a catch up with Richard's institution. That was fantastic, and thank you so much to Lynn and Chris as well for your answers to questions in the chat. And like I say, this will be available, this webinar will be available on YouTube for you to view at your own leisure. So just before you go, I'd like to just present another poll just to see how you've got on with it, today's session. How did you find the 60-minute tech talk? I'm just going to present that to you now. So if you could give me your honest opinion. So we've got some slightly usefuls. I don't know if you remember, I did make myself laugh listening to the recording from last time, what I said I would do, but I'm not going to repeat that. So we've got some with moderately and very, which is fantastic. So thank you so much. I think it's just really useful to talk to other people with similar issues. And thank you all so much for attending and for your support. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.